Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing Sing to God by Cardiacs.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
So today we're going to be reviewing Sing to God by Cardiacs, not the Cardiacs, just Cardiacs. And the thing is that in 5 days time we're going to come back to this band one final time with yet another album of theirs called A Little Man in a House and the Whole World Window. But for now, here's some of my favorite bits from today's album.
Waters always welcome on the deck. But we love the sex. We never ever sing like Marky. We wanna be done like Sparky. I got river in my shoes and find me everything
So at the start of the year, when I first made this list in its first incarnation, we've actually had no Cardiacs albums on the list whatsoever. So how did it come to the point where we not only have one Cardiacs album, but actually two? Well, originally on the list we had an album or a demo mixtape, I really don't know what to call it, and its name was Four Little Boys, made by Ad Noisim. And when a certain person called David, whom you might know him as Runcible Moon, started watching the series, he informed me that this album was a very obscure and unheard of piece of Cardiacs media that wasn't made by them but is instead a demo tape that is heavily inspired by them but at the same time not being equally as good in any level. So that led to David and me having a very nice chat over on the emails where he recommended to me that instead of that obscure album I should put one of the Cardiacs albums, seeing as I didn't have any on the list, and the one they recommended for me was no other than A Little Man in a House and the Whole World Window. So that explains that album, but how did Sing to God actually also make it on the list? And well, this is something which is more relevant if you look at this video and the real time in which it was posted, because as of doing this series you might remember that about 3 months ago we've had 10 new slots open on the list, and I gave it up to the viewers of this channel to vote on the albums they wanted to hear and see me review, and well, Sing to God was one of those albums. So yeah, this is how we turned the list with no Cardiacs albums to having two Cardiacs albums, and unfortunately there's one more album by theirs that I would have loved to have on here, but it doesn't make an appearance, so I'll review it next year. But for now, let's talk about this album and the band behind it. So the origins of Cardiacs actually dates all the way back to 1977, where it all began with a set of two brothers which have the most benign all-white Christian names that I've ever heard, called Tim Smith and Jim Smith. And the band was formed in the hometown of two brothers called Chessington in Surrey in England, and the initial name for the band was actually Cardiac Arrest. Now the first 3 releases of the band didn't actually come as full-fledged albums, but instead as demo tapes that the band recorded a limited amount of and then distributed only in venues and live shows they were performing at. And these, let's say, unofficial releases, early releases of Cardiacs, were basically just big demo tapes. They didn't have a high production level, and honestly, when it comes to replayability today, a lot of them are remembered as like the side projects, the thing that led to the actual greatness of this band. Nevertheless, these demo tapes did have one major importance, and that's containing a lot of songs that would later make a reappearance in the later Cardiac albums, this time with a much better production level. But as it stands, the first real studio album by the band was released all the way in 1988, and it was released under the brothers' own label, which they founded 4 years beforehand, called the Alphabet Business Concern. Now, even by 1984, the band was not only consisting of the two brothers, but instead it grew trifold, and they were now a sextet, and this sextet would be considered as the classic lineup of Cardiacs. And at that time, the band would be playing constantly, and maybe most notably, they would be supporting the act of Marillion, spearheaded by Fish, whom he actually personally invited them to play alongside him. Now, just before we actually get into the subject matter of today's review, I have to share with you this very odd story about the band that I found originating in 1987. So apparently back in that year, the Sunday Sport newspaper published an article about Cardiacs, accusing them of having incestuous relationships inside of the band. And when I read this today, the first thing that came into my mind had to be,
oh my freaking god, don't tell me that Jimmy and Timmy actually did it.
But lo and behold, that was definitely not the case. The article was actually referring to Tim Smith and another member of the band called Sarah Smith, whom they both happened to share the same last name. But eventually it actually took Tim's mother, Eileen Smith, to disrupt all of this and debunk the assumptions of incest, and that basically left the band with a bit more publicity that was honestly very good for the entire ordeal. Anyway, moving on, the band would move on to release 2 banger albums consecutively, with the first one being out in 1988 called The Little Man and a House in the Whole World Window, and then the next banger one, which is considered by many to be the pivotal album for this band, called On Land and in the Sea, which is that album that unfortunately didn't make it on this year's list. But unfortunately, the following years would see several band members from Cardiacs leaving the band. The first one was Sarah Smith, so that basically saw the departure of the saxophone, which made the band so iconic up until that point. Later on was Tim Key, who was unfortunately never replaced. And lastly came the departure of William D. Drake, who left the band in 1991. Now, William D. Drake was the keyboardist for the band, and I might have not heard the rest of their albums quite yet, but from everything that I've read, his keyboard playing was unmatched and made it so iconic in the band's sound. And well, the band did try to find a replacement for him on the keyboards, but no one was able to pick up the challenge that he left behind him, so in future incarnations and shows of the band, they would literally play a playback of his original keyboard recordings. Nevertheless, Cardiacs would grow strong from this unfortunate experience, and they would soldier onwards, as well as always keeping very close connections to the members of the band that have left, and sometimes even working with them. And well, in 1992, Cardiacs came back with a blast in a new form of a quartet and released a very good album, but what might be their last greatest magnum opus came out in 1996, being the album we're reviewing today, called Sing to God. And let me tell you this now, this double album is a monster album. I honestly didn't know what to expect when coming into the Cardiacs, but I kinda knew that I wasn't gonna be disappointed, and this album proved me entirely correct. So in order to review this one, I'll actually open my opening statements with the negative sides of this one, seeing as there are really not a lot of them, but there's a lot of positives. So speaking of the negatives of this album, there's actually only one thing that I would really like to focus on, and that's the length. And besides the fact fact that the album is very much lengthy, and that's not a bad thing on its own. I just do believe that in one sitting this is a lot to take in. I do believe that the length actually shows itself as a problem with the longer tracks. So Sing to God actually consists of 22 individual tracks, with most of them averaging at around 4 minutes of runtime. But then you have 3 other tracks which kind of blow that perception all the ways around, and they actually have an average runtime of around about 8 to even 9 minutes. And well, in my personal perception of this album, it seems to me like Cardiacs know what they're doing better when it comes to the shorter songs. They know how to do stuff right when it comes to the shorter playtime. And when it comes down to these 3 longer tracks, they've been consistently kind of monotonous and repetitive. They have pretty nice beginnings, but then towards the end they just come back to those very repetitive sections that honestly, in the ever-shifting atmosphere of this album, it almost felt like these long and arduous moments were just unintentional record scratches. But with that being said, that's my negatives for this album, so let's try maybe in short and talk about the overnumbering positives that this one has. So on the Prog Archives, this album and this band are considered to be a Rio, which means rock in opposition / avant-prog band. Now I am well aware that they're not originally Rio, they're not a part of the original Rio movement, and that's totally understandable, but when it comes down to the term literally, this is exactly what I'd expect rock and opposition music to sound like. Everything that is contemporary and accessible and rightly done in rock music is done entirely opposite on here, and I honestly love it to bits. And another thing that I like about this one and why it's so hard for me to call this avant-prog is because it doesn't feel like it's trying to be weird and avant-garde for the sake of being so, but instead it is very much approachable and there's a lot to dig into here, and the music itself is really fun to listen to, yet it doesn't conform to anything that I've ever heard. And Cardiacs on this album have invented their own sound, although despite being inspired by punk and grunge and psych music and even carnival music for the better part of this album, it does seem like they have their own unique sound on here, which I personally really like, and from everything that I've read, this unique sound has turned them into some sort of a cult band, which is a good thing because they have a very devout fan base, but in another sense they have been shunned from most of the music listening masses. Now I wouldn't be able to actually go ahead and dissect this album song by song, so instead let's do this. I'll just read out some quotes that I wrote while reviewing this album in my notebook as to what I thought the music sounded like. If Queen had gone entirely mad. Bright and dystopian carnival themes. Nirvana meets the Nile Song by Pink Floyd. Beatles gone rogue. And the odd brother of madness that nobody really talks about. And speaking about the beloved group of ska which is known as Madness, which is probably my favorite non-progressive band of all time, their sound is quite similar to the Cardiacs without the avant-garde nature of it per se, but something about the deep-rooted 80s English sound on here really resonated with me because I did grow up on Madness, and this felt like a lot of what I like, at least in the basis of it. Now just to add some footnotes about this album, I point out a few songs on here. So my favorite song from the album has to be Dog Like Sparky. This song, it comes in the form of the 3rd track on the entire album. It is so good, an immediate 10 out of 10 song, just a splendid song. And honestly, if you don't know this album and you don't have enough time to actually give it a full listen, I highly suggest that you just go ahead, check out that song, and if you like it, you can move on to listening to this entire album because it basically sounds much like that. Another interesting song on here is A Horse's Tale. If you ever find yourself in a sticky situation in which you need Viagra but you've just ran out, just go ahead, give this song a listen for a moment and it'll do the job. Oh my god, that sounded so wrong. I meant it was gonna, pump your blood. I didn't mean anything else. I'm gonna continue. And the song No Gold actually sounds like it has been played entirely in reverse. Now I don't know if that's the case, I know there are a lot of reverse elements on it, but if that is the case, it's such a brilliant song, and nevertheless it is my second favorite track from this entire album. And yeah, I think this is where I'll stop for today because this review is getting absurdly long for my taste, and you'll probably have a lot of corrections for me down in the comments of this video, so I'll free up some time in order to actually fill those blank spaces when we review this band again in just 5 days time. But for now, let's talk about this album's cover. The album cover is probably the most straightforward thing when it comes to this entire album, and honestly I love the fact that they decided to make this one very much accessible and welcoming when it comes to representing a very mind-boggling album. And that's of course if you even consider this type of cover to be welcoming. Anyhow, I love this cover, I love how it is composed, I love the oversized eyes on the band members, it looks so quirky and so cool, and it just kind of feels like they're staring at you and whispering, hey, yeah? You're gonna listen to this entire album? Yeah, you're gonna do it in one listen? Yeah? Are you that tough? But all in all, this album cover definitely has become quite iconic in its tiny separate realm from music, and it is the face, or should I say it's the 4 faces of a very interesting musical exploration. So for now, and this might absolutely change in the future and probably will only be going upwards, this album is gonna get a very, very fine and representing rating of 9 out of 10. But that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video because I definitely have, and this one was a long and arduous task to make, but I got through it. And anyway, stay tuned for tomorrow because we're going to be reviewing Felona e Sorona by the band Liorme. I of course want to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Wanham, Rist of Kings, and Lindsay Haycox. You guys are just the best, and if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my about page. But that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye, guys.